And welcome once more to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Joining me is Juan Zarate. He's our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you as always.
Bob, great seeing you. Thank you.
So let's revisit something we've talked about many times in the past, Ukraine and the U.S. policy in terms of whether or not we ought to get more involved there.
Yeah, the question now is, with what appears to be continued Russian arming of the rebels in eastern Ukraine and continued offenses by the rebels, who don't seem to be interested in any sort of ceasefire, seem more interested in acquiring territory and making advances to more and more parts of eastern Ukraine. What should we do? Because the sanctions that have been put in place, the economic isolation, has been devastating. In addition, the price of oil dropping to below $50 a barrel has been devastating to the Russians. But even with all of that, it hasn't been enough to change the Russian calculus, and the Russians have not taken any of these so-called diplomatic off-ramps that the U.S. and Europe have offered President Putin. And so the real question is, what changes the calculus? What changes the dynamics on the ground? And what can be done to help the Ukrainians? And all along, the question of whether or not we arm more heavily, more aggressively the Ukrainians has been front and center as part of that debate.
So if pressure on Putin didn't get it done, what you're saying is maybe we have to get more directly involved here.
Yeah, I think that's part of the debate. I actually think that that's right. The economic sanctions, though potentially devastating, may not affect the strategic calculus of the Kremlin in terms of what's happening on the ground in the Ukraine. And you have to add other dimensions of leverage to affect that. And that may be sending a signal that we are going to arm and in some ways defend Kiev and its forces against this onslaught of Russian armament and including troops. The question, though, is how do you do it? What's the timing? Are we going to do it sort of in real time, or is this going to be a long-standing debate? The Russians will read those signals, and I think it's very important that if we do make the decision, that we actually make a decision to do the arming and to do it well. If we do it in sort of half measures and it's delayed, the Russians will see that as weakness, and it may even spark further adventurism.
What's the risk here? I mean, we can't really kind of get in a little bit. We either have to be in or not in terms of arming.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the challenge for President Obama and the Europeans, President Merkel included from Germany, which is if you do get involved, you're committing not just your reputation, but a strategy to confronting the Russians. And the U.S. and Europe haven't wanted to take that maximalist step to say, look, we're in direct military confrontation with Russia or its proxies. That's a big step.
And what if it doesn't work? Then what's next?
Right, and and the question of escalation is one that has bedeviled and worried this president since he took office. Do we engage in policies or practices that are actually going to make the problem worse? And are we going to see escalation, inadvertent perhaps, but escalation that we hadn't calculated or wanted? And I think that's been part of the reticence by the U.S., by Europe, to actually throw more arms, more weaponry, more advisors into this conflict, because no one really wants a war with Russia. The problem is Russia wants to keep fighting and supporting these rebels, and the fighting hasn't ended.
If the U.S. and European friends, if they all continue to stand back, do you see any way this ends in a positive way for Ukraine?
No, I mean, the best case scenario is you have kind of a split, chaotic Ukrainian state with the East really just hived off and is part of a sphere of influence for Russia. A worst case scenario is you've got a broadening scope of territory that these rebels control, that Russia's influencing, and real instability in Kiev, and a demonstration effect to all of the Russia's neighbors that Russia's not to be trifled with, and Russia then gaining more and more influence in places like the Baltics, in Bulgaria, in places where Russia has really tried to influence in the past.
Is this more about tactics and strategy, or is this more about Putin's ego?
I think this is more about both, actually, because I think part of Russia's strategy at this point is about Putin exerting his power and the power of Russia to remake the map and to, in some ways, turn back the clock to what happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall and at the end of the Cold War. He has said explicitly that was a devastating period for Russia. And what he's trying to do is reassert its influence and its role on the world stage. and by proxy, his as well. And so I think it's a bit of both. But it is a broad question. How do we deal with this kind of a Russia, with this kind of a leader that really doesn't want peace at the negotiating table, regardless of all the meetings, and really where his proxies are fighting, with his support, a real dangerous battle in the middle of Europe?
Juan, thanks as always.
Bob, I'm not going to let you go, because this is our last Flashpoints. You've had a 21-year career at CBS. I haven't known you all those years, but I've been fortunate to know you for the last 6. I count you as a dear friend, an incredible professional, and one of the best correspondents I've ever seen. And CBS is losing a great professional, a great man, and I feel like I'm losing a great friend. But our relationship doesn't end with the end of Flashpoints. I hope to see you again very soon. And I just wanted to let you know how much I love you and respect you, and thank you.
Juan, thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr.